hello, and welcome to Basic Folk, where we have honest conversations with folk musicians. It is I, your host, Cindy Howes. Thanks for listening. Okay, yes, I cried when I interviewed Rachel Baiman. Her writing is stirring and brutal, and then when you read about the inspiration behind the songs on her new album, Cycles, it's like automatic waterworks for me. From frank observations of her grandparents' loss of agency when aging, to women reckoning with the heaviness and grief of motherhood. I am into the emotion of these songs. Rachel came to songwriting after she had spent her youth mastering the fiddle. She actually kept her school life separate from her fiddle life, where she would pal around with other kids at fiddle contests and also play in jams with people 4 times her age. She attended Vanderbilt in Nashville for an anthropology degree where she centered a lot of her research papers on the fiddle. She left Nashville to study in Edinburgh and took full advantage of the music community she found. That would also set her up to seek out a music community in Nashville upon her return. Rachel is known for her solo career and for her, quote, nerdy fiddle duo 10-String Symphony with fiddle player Christian Settlemeyer. The band deconstructs traditional forms and incorporates a lot of original elements. She's 3 albums deep into her solo work, the latest being produced by Liv Halley of the Australian indie band Oh Pep. For Cycles, she went to Melbourne to record with Liv to get into Liv's scene. Rachel says, I kind of had this theory that if you want a specific sound, go to the place, use the studio, use the person, use the gear, get into the vibe of the place. The album, while it's rooted in her folk sound, has a grittier and poppier edge that I find irresistible. It's on the top of my list for 2021 so far. Also, she gives us the details on her super cute house and what it means to have a place like that to call home. Lots of leaking eyes, also known as crying, for Rachel Baiman. We'll take a listen to the title track from her new album, Cycles, and then we'll get into our conversation with Rachel Baiman on Basic Folk.
I will come to your door with all the things I've seen before. Watch you struggle for your glory, breathing life into the fury. Motherhood isn't kind, a constant race against the time. From one body, another born, from one love, another torn. My heart goes out to you. Everything is coming soon. I'm rising as you bloom, but I see myself in everything you do.
Rachel, thank you so much for talking to me today. I really love your new record.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. Let's dig into your whole entire life.
Okay. Sounds
Ready?
good.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Okay. So you grew up without religion, but your parents would take you to meetings at the Ethical Humanist Society of Greater Chicago, which I don't know what that is, but it sounds intense. So what were those meetings like for you, and how did the early exposure to that environment impact you?
Wow. Well, those meetings were like kind of kumbaya vibes and very sort of hippy-dippy, crunchy take on religion, but it was a very low-key kind of crowd. So it was very, I don't know, it was kind of like stuffy and boring as a kid, I would say. But I got put in like the Sunday school room, which was basically just, it was not as much of a meeting. It was more of just like your average Sunday school class that one might expect, except for there was no kind of talk of God or Jesus or any sort of religious thing. It was just like, how do we be nice to people? That was kind of the vibe. So
how to do your taxes, how to write a check.
Oh, I wish. I mean, that would have been great.
Right.
No, I think it was, my parents come from mixed backgrounds. So his dad was Jewish, his mom was Christian, but she kind of converted and they moved to Israel. So he kind of grew up very Jewish ethnically. And my mom kind of grew up vaguely Christian, but not super religious. And he felt really strongly that that we should not go to any kind of church. So even like the Unitarian Universalist church, which was like, I actually had friends that went there and I was like, that seems way more normal. Like, can we just go there? And he was like, no, that's still Christian, you know? So he's very much like, he didn't want us to have that kind of like dominating Christian upbringing of the US. Like he felt kind of oppressed by that, I think. So this was kind of his answer. And my mom was like, well, that's fine with me. She wasn't particularly religious. And this was kind of their happy medium, as it was for a lot of people, I think, coming from kind of mixed families and a lot of people that had had negative experiences with religion as well.
You were kind of accidentally introduced to fiddle music as a young kid. Were you 4 years old when you were starting? You wanted to play an instrument, and your family found someone who was willing to teach you, and it was Mike Casey, who actually secretly was into the folk and traditional folk fiddle tunes. So what do you remember about first connecting with the instrument, how Mike maybe helped you connect with it, and what made you want to put so much of yourself into the fiddle?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting thing because I don't think that I was intentionally trying to play fiddle music, but like Mike really was much more a fiddle player than a classical violinist, and he really introduced me to that whole community. And especially in my hometown, there was a little jam circle of people that were into folk and fiddle tunes. And my parents met at a contra dance in New England, and they were very familiar with the concept of fiddle music, which I think was really cool because they knew what it was and they were like, oh, fiddle is cool. Like, you should do that. So when I was a kid, I was just playing tunes, and I think my first focus was just on, how do I play this instrument? And then it wasn't until I went to this camp outside of Nashville, and I heard, Bruce Molsky and Aubrey Haney and Andy Leftwich and Brittany Haas, and I heard all this incredible, like, fiddle music from all of these, like, deep, rich traditions. And that's when I, like...
Those are, like, a bunch of Bruce Springsteens of fiddle.
Yeah,
that you just mentioned.
And I really fell in love with it then. And that was kind of when it became more about an art form for me and less about just learning how to play the instrument. I always enjoyed playing the instrument, but I was just doing it like I went to gymnastics class, or, it was just like a thing that I did. And then when I was like 14 or so, that's when I really kind of fell in love with it and started really digging in more to music in general and, finding artists that I love.
So you were seeing Bruce Molsky and Brittany Haas play at these camps. What was it about their, like, presentation? Or, because I've heard, like, fiddle players talk about being really drawn to folk and fiddle because of the community that's around it. Was that a thing for you?
I think it was to some extent. I mean, definitely I went to public school in Chicago, and I didn't have, it wasn't something that I, like, talked about with my friends at school. Like, that, it was kind of like a completely different part of my life because nobody at school had any idea what I was, they didn't know anything about fiddle music, nor were they interested. Like, we were listening to hip hop and R&B and, like, so, I did my normal kid stuff, and then I had this kind of secret part of my life where I would go to these fiddle camps, and, I did meet people my age that I think had similar musical interests. So that was cool. But in terms of the community, like, for me in my day-to-day, it was actually a very weird community because it was like all these old guys at the at the farmer's market, like, it wasn't my peers. So I do think it was largely just about the music, but also, I think I'm like a culture geek. Like, I'm really, really interested in deeply understanding different cultures. And so it's just one way that you can kind of dig in more to the human experience. Like, I ended up majoring in anthropology, and I think that's, like, not an accident. Like, it's kind of the same thing to me. So I think that's more what it was about for me. But the Midwest, where I grew up, like, the fiddle style that's in rural Illinois is quite bare bones and, like, stripped down and straightforward. And the styles I was hearing from these other regions were really different, like more syncopation, more interesting variety. So I think that's kind of what made the spark for me.
your answer to that question has opened up so many other questions, particularly like your separate lives, like your fiddle life separate from your school life. I can totally relate to that. When I was a kid, I was in 4-H and I lived in like a suburban town, like 20 miles south of Boston. So it was like very much like a weird thing that you just like, well, that's just like not what I talk about when I'm at school, because it's totally weird. But do you see any like lasting impacts from that experience of like having two separate experiences as a kid?
Lasting impacts. I mean, I guess it definitely made me excited to move to Nashville and like try to find a community of people that I feel like were kind of interested in the same things as me.
It's kind of like they're out there.
I mean, I was like a huge nerd and I didn't have a ton of friends, but you know, I had my little circle and that was enough. Like I had my two best friends and we just, I would say I had like a very chill and minimal high school experience. It was totally fine though. And then when I went to college, that was like the most outsider that I've ever been, because I went to Vanderbilt and it was very like fancy and like Greek and none of my values. And I wasn't in a sorority or anything. And so I think like maybe
that's what you mean when you say Greek. I'm like, interesting.
Yeah.
Greek.
And I just like, I hated everything about the social scene there. So I just like made myself an outsider and, maybe
man. Rachel, you and I are friends.
Yeah, of course we are. You have a podcast called Basic Folk.
Oh my God. I also did not relate to that culture at all.
No, I mean, it's a terrible culture. Why would you relate to it?
Be weird if you did.
I agree, but nobody else agrees with me.
Something else I think that came up for you when you moved to Nashville was being around people who came from very strong religious backgrounds. What did you make of that as somebody who did not have that growing up?
Yeah, I think it was actually really good for me to have a little bit more experience with that. I think that, you know, growing up where I did, it was quite a liberal bubble, and it was very, you know, ethnically, racially, economically diverse, which I'm really grateful for, but it was not very like politically diverse. So, which was nice at the time, but it was also like really good for me to understand that that was not actually the entirety of the country, and that people did have these really strong positive attachments to religion, which I didn't really understand, I don't think.
Weird, huh?
Where I did. Yeah, and like it has been really good to kind of understand that more deeply. And I think that just deciding that you think something because it's the only thing that you've ever experienced doesn't make you a very effective empathizer, communicator, or, you know, student of human experience. So I really appreciated that opportunity to kind of see another side of the country and another way that people grew up despite like not really understanding and relating to it. So I do think that when I kind of circled back to it's like I grew up having all the opinions, but it was just what I knew and what I was told. And then I had my phase of kind of trying to understand what I actually thought outside of, you know, what I was brought up with. And when I circled back with my own opinions again, I think I had a much more nuanced understanding of like what all the different, you know, cultures and upbringings that exist, especially in the American South, which is a complex but really amazing place.
In the same topic, how did your awareness to being a woman changed when you moved to Nashville?
Well, it changed a lot, actually. I think that, you know, I went to a very progressive public high school, and I had, you know, there was tons of amazing female role models, and I really didn't think about my gender very much as in terms of my career possibilities or, you know, what I should or could do in school. Like it really wasn't, I didn't feel the weight of that, I think. But in Nashville, I did. And first at Vanderbilt, because I feel like that, at least when I was there, the culture for women was so toxic. It was like a lot of pressure to be perfect in your appearance, perfect in your classes, and kind of be all things. And that was like something that the women took pride in at Vanderbilt, and I found kind of horrifying. But and it was so gendered too. Like the whole Greek system is so gendered, you know, so binary. So there was like a very specific role that each gender was supposed to play, which I found really weird. I also really struggled with the person that was supposed to be mentoring me on fiddle, and the relationship there was a little bit oppressive, I think, for women. And then when I started playing gigs, you know, that's like a whole nother can of worms. So I definitely had those first experiences of like showing up for a pop country gig and, you know, being told like, oh, well, like you need to wear lipstick and polish your boots and like have this specific look because you're kind of being hired for the appearance rather than the actual musical part of it. And then just having the experience of trying to kind of like be a presence in a jam where I was the only female and like feeling really intimidated and not welcomed into the kind of like boys scene. So I think those things came later for me, and I really didn't realize that it was going to be such an issue in my life. You know, it's like, which
you have to like reverse engineer the situation.
Well,
I bet that anthropology degree helped a lot.
I was so naive, you know, like I was so naive in high school because I was in such a good place and I didn't know that the rest of the world wasn't like that, you know? So it was definitely a little bit of a wake-up call, I would say.
Okay, so in talking about that anthropology degree, you were still playing fiddle in college and you would often write papers about it. You got research grants to basically just like dive in. How did approaching the music from that academic angle help you better understand it?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think with fiddle music, if you're, you know, depending on how you want to be a fiddle player, a lot of it is broader than just the music. I mean, I think that the culture surrounding it is such a big part of the music. And so it's like when you are a snobby trained musician and you think that the only thing that matters is being able to improvise the most chordally educated solo, which I was never that good at that. So I wouldn't say I was that person, but like you meet those people and you could play them a recording of a really old fiddle tune, and to them it's going to sound terrible because it's scratchy, it's out of tune, it might be, you know, a little out of time. And like, it's hard, I think, to understand from that perspective why that music would be important or meaningful. So being able to understand kind of like the history and development of a style of music and what you want to pull from the past to add interest and add roots to your sound versus what you want to make your own. I mean, I think you have to kind of take a deep dive. And that applies to any style of music, like regardless of, you know, whether it's old-time fiddle or rock and roll or classical. Like, I think it does apply to all those styles. It's just that a lot of people don't realize that, except in the fiddle world, everyone's like really into that. So,
Right.
Yeah, I think just being a student of culture, like there's so much to be gained from understanding like past musicians, and that you can't understand all of it just based on technical prowess, if that makes sense.
So I want to talk about your nerdy fiddle duo, 10-String Symphony with Christian Settelmeyer. And it's here's the thesis of the band. The band deconstructs traditional forms and incorporates a lot of original elements. In hearing you describe 10-String Symphony as a nerdy fiddle duo, I want to know like what it's been like for you to get very nerdy about the fiddle with other people, like Christian and also probably George, your husband. Mm-hmm. And how has like the process of deconstructing tradition felt for you as a younger player?
Well, I think Christian and I kind of made that band at a really formative time for both of us. Like we were both kind of trying to figure out what our personal musical styles were, because we were both at a point in our careers where we were just trying to technically get so much better and learn how to play. Like for me, it was learning how to improvise, learning how to interact with songs, and like just get really technically good at the fiddle. And for him, I think it was learning about traditional styles of fiddle, because he kind of came from a classical and rock background, and he really was like behind on that kind of stuff. Like he didn't have that experience of going to the camps and workshops as a kid. And so I think he always felt really like he was playing catch up on the kind of like, oh, what are the tunes that I should know? And, you know, what are the like old time sensibilities that I kind of missed out on? And so there was a lot of things that we were learning from each other in that sense. And then in that like frantic desire to be good enough to be professionals that I think everyone feels like in their early 20s, and trying to just like, you know, do in my mind what I felt like I needed to do to like be the musician that I wanted to be. And during that time, like by accident almost, we like kind of found our own styles and developed our own sound as a band. And a lot of that was just about being really aggressively risky with our harmonic decisions and our like deconstruction decisions for the band. And it came naturally because we were trying to do this band with just fiddles. So there wasn't a lot of options. Like it kind of had to be that way. And that was really fun for us. So I think it was a combination of just being very open to risk taking and not knowing what we were doing that led us down these fun avenues. And it was a really cool project for me in terms of developing songwriting style, thinking about arranging songs, arranging, you know, band movements and arcs of songs, and what I wanted to say. And like, because there was just the two of us, someone had to write songs, someone had to sing them. So we both became front people, you know, and that was really good. That was a really good exercise.
Is that when you first started singing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is when I first started singing. And it's also when I first started writing songs, kind of out of necessity. I mean, we would go downtown and busk sometimes just because we were like, well, we're just playing tunes around the house all the time. Might as well just like go make money while we do it. And it would be so loud downtown, and I'd be like, let's just like yell a fiddle tune, and then people will, you know, like let's yell an old time song, people will pay attention to us. So I would play my fiddle and start singing, you know, like Red Rocking Chair or like Fly Around My Pretty Little Mess, you know, like those like classic catchy tunes that people would be like, yeah, it's so awesome, because like you're singing and playing the fiddle at the same time. And that's kind of how we led us down that path of trying to do more of that and then getting really artsy about it.
I've heard you talk about like coming into your songwriting, but can you talk about coming into your singing? You have such a really cool voice. It's like hard for me to believe that you like started singing so late.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Well, I feel really untrained as a singer. So it's kind of I guess it's just been a trial and error process. I think that my singing is very much rooted in old time singing. It's very much about projecting and over the fiddle, because I think I had to kind of yell over the fiddle so long. So I ended up being a pretty loud singer. And, you know, there's so many different singing styles based on genre, which I learned like when I was in college. So I started 10-string symphony when I was still in college. And my last year or so, I took lessons with an amazing teacher at Vanderbilt named Liz Johnson, and she was a jazz singer. Mm-hmm. And it was my first experience ever with singing lessons. Like I really had no idea what I was doing, but I was like, I have this opportunity while I'm in school. I should just try to get some lessons from her. And what she really taught me was to sing in the way that I speak, like to really be vulnerable and myself as a singer the same way that I would while I was speaking. Because I think if you're not a trained singer, you kind of try to like, you think you have to kind of switch your brain to singing, and you come out with this like weird voice that isn't really related to the way that you speak. A lot of it's like using your falsetto or whatever. And she was like a jazz singer, which is kind of the closest technical singing to like pop or, you know, popular music. I don't mean like pop singing, but, you know, anything that's not classical or opera basically is...
Or secular
is coming from like a jazz singing technique perspective. But the funny thing is that she would have me try to sing these jazz standards, and I seriously could not sing these melodies because they just made no, like, I was so untrained at jazz at that point. I mean, I'm still not trained in jazz at all, but I like feel like I understand it chordally a little bit more. But at the time, like, old time melodies are so straightforward, and so like it's like one of the three notes in the chord is going to be the note you're singing. There's no
because
other...
everybody has to sing them.
Yeah, they're folk songs, you know, like they're supposed, yeah. And I just like, I wasn't playing jazz on the fiddle either. So the melodies just like, I seriously could not sing these songs. So
it's like another language.
Yeah.
Learning another language.
And
yeah.
I think I was like so far outside of her realm of understanding that she didn't even really know how to like explain to me how to sing these melodies. And so I feel like I was like the worst voice student. But at the same time, I learned so much. I mean, I really feel like that helped me find my voice so much. And then the rest of it was just trial and error with recording, live shows. I mean, recording is really great for singing because there's no hiding, and you have to hear it so many times. And now, especially like during the pandemic, you start recording everything because everything is either a video or a live stream or there was no like performance that disappeared ever. So I got very in tune with what I sound like on every syllable of every song. So that's a good way to learn.
So yeah, I want to hear about your journey into songwriting. You were starting to like hang out with a lot of songwriters in Nashville, and it was just kind of like this infectious thing for you. And at the same time, it seems like you were kind of coming to terms with the fact that you were raised with like such progressive views was going to allow you to do something like positive and productive in the world. And you have this great quote. You said, songwriting is a unique opportunity to do that because it avails a more emotional vehicle for discussion. Can you talk about the realization of using songwriting as a vehicle for expression?
Yeah, that's been kind of a long process for me, I think. One of the people that really influenced me the most was Kelsey Walden, if you've heard of her. She was one of my best friends when I first moved to town, and I played a lot of music with her, and she would write these incredible songs, and she was the one who introduced me to Townes Van Zandt and Guy Clark and all these like amazing old songwriters, and Dolly Parton's bluegrass record. And I just remember like she always had something cool playing, and this was kind of the beginning of my listening to anything besides fiddle music and instrumental music. So I was kind of coming out of that instrumental brain and understanding this whole other world. And John Hartford, entered my consciousness, and a lot of more contemporary songwriters that were around us. So I think first I just had to understand songs and the role they played and their structure and meaning. And when I got to a point where I was thinking about values and politics and those kind of things, I realized how amazing that that vehicle was. And I do think that in the writing of the Shame album, that was really me kind of finding the overlap of these different elements of my life, which had previously seemed so separate. My kind of like academic school life with my Chicago friends and my political family, and then my kind of musical life, which had largely existed in much more conservative spaces because I was playing bluegrass and old time, and I didn't really see how they interacted until I kind of started writing for that album. And then I was like, oh, like I think this is who I'm going to be as an artist, but that took a long time to figure that out because there's so much I always think of it as like arts and crafts. Like you have to kind of learn the craft before you can do the art. And there was so much crafting that I had to understand to feel like I had some kind of art to put out. And that's kind of when it clicked for me, I think. And then with this new album, I have been thinking a lot about the effectiveness of, empathy and change and human understanding through songwriting. And for me, that's really trying to tell human stories that are universally relatable rather than trying to give a speech about right and wrong, you know?
I've heard you talking about letting go of the notion of being technically perfect in your music and the power of imperfection, which, thank you, Brene Brown. I also believe that.
Yes.
What has been your relationship to perfection in terms of the fiddle and your songwriting?
I think that I spent many years trying to be perfect on the fiddle, and because of the roundabout way that I arrived at songwriting, it did not carry the same kind of stress and inferiority complex that I had with the fiddle. If anybody has something that they've been doing since they were a kid and like became their kind of like main identity as a person, I think there's just so much baggage that goes along with that.
Who was setting these expectations for you and the fiddle?
Me. Like, absolutely me. I was like, yeah, well, but I think that's okay. You know, that's just like once I fell in love with it, you know, I really wanted to be good at it. And when you're young, I think it's hard to understand what being good means in a nuanced way. It's like, well, you're either the best one at the jam or you're not, you know, and because you're only thinking of it in like who's playing the fastest and the coolest solo and knows the most licks and knows the most tunes and, you know, has the best groove or whatever it is that is on your brain at that moment. So I think I spent a long time being very stressed about not being good enough to be a professional fiddle player in Nashville or whether I would ever get to that point. And what ended up happening is I just took like a hard turn into songwriting and landed there and then kind of stopped worrying. Like I honestly play and get called for way more fiddle stuff now, and I really don't care. I mean, I care, but I don't care if I'm the best fiddle player. You know what I mean? Like, that's not what I'm worried about. And I think that comes across in the way I play the instrument, because it doesn't sound like I'm stressed out and trying to be something I'm not. I'm just playing the fiddle as I am, where I am, which is always when music sounds the best. You know, when you're not trying to play as a better version of yourself, you're just playing as yourself in that moment.
Sounds like a lot of like being controlled by fear and anxiety.
Yeah. Oh, totally. I mean, I think that is like trying to master an instrument. That's like the epitome of it. Yes. And but I never had that with songwriting. It's always been really joyful for me. I've never been stressed about it. And it's not because I think I'm like the best songwriter in the world. It's just because it's I just don't feel like it's something you can compare. You know, like I'm never like, oh, these are the best songwriters, and you know, because it's like there's no measure for that. It's such a personal thing. It's like everyone's creating art that is really personal to them, and so it's always been a total, like songwriting has always been a total safe place for me, which I'm grateful for, and I hope it never changes.
Me too. That sounds great.
Yeah.
I love that. I've said that a lot during this interview after your answers. I'm enjoying it.
Good.
So I got to talk for Folk Alley, I got to talk to Andrew Marlin.
Oh, cool.
He did a guest DJ set when he released his solo records this year.
Cool. That's awesome.
And he's going to be on Basic Folk for Watch House's new album. And I'm so excited to talk to him because he's like so smart and great and like just the chillest, coolest person. And he produced your solo album, Shame.
Yes.
So all that to preface that like the themes on that album were very centered around like demanding space for yourself and for like women in general.
Yeah.
And like you were working with like an all white male cis crew on the record, and I'm sure they're like all just as lovely as Andrew.
Yes.
But you have said that there were like some songs that were hard to discuss with like all men. And on your new record, Cycles, you worked with mostly women, including Liv Halley of OPEP, who produced the record. And so like now that you've gone through both situations, what was it like for you to work with all men versus working with mostly women in the studio?
Yeah, it was a really interesting contrast. And yeah, I mean, again, I would preface this by saying that Andrew was an amazing producer for that record, and, you know, I wouldn't change anything. But it was weird to, like, keep singing this song, Shame, and, like, also, I mean, there was so many, like, very personal songs on that record. Take a Stand was really hard. It was just internal, you know, like, I was scared to bring it up.
What's the background of that song?
That's about an experience I had, like, with a much older kind of mentor figure. And I feel like it's something that took me a long time of reflecting on it to kind of get to a point where I was like, actually, I think this is kind of messed up. And I had a lot of friends that were in really similar situations. It's like when you're, you know, in that gray area age, like 17, 18, 19, and it's like, are you a kid? Are you an adult? And I saw this happen a lot in college, and it's just like once I finally kind of had the space from it where I was like, I think that like this was kind of like not a healthy situation. And, you know, the song is always like kind of a more exaggerated version of the situation because you're writing about the feelings, not the facts. If that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it's a really intense song. And like that one and Shame, it was weird. Like I didn't want to talk about it with them. I didn't want to talk about what it was about. Whereas I think had I been with Liv or someone, I would have felt very comfortable just being like, well, you know what this is about, blah, 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 blah. And so it just was like more of an insular experience. Like I felt like I was alone in that moment in the studio, and I didn't feel unsupported. I just felt really awkward, basically. And I was also really new to like making records. So I didn't, in terms of like making a solo record where like the only records I'd made previous to that were 10 String Symphony, which is like, it's already kind of determined what you're going to record because you've made the arrangements. It's just going to be the band. You know, it's a very different experience bringing songs to life in the studio when you have any option available to you in terms of like instrumentation. That's really like producing a record versus just like recording what you've already arranged. Mm-hmm. So that was a new experience for me. And musically, you know, the input and guidance that Andrew offered, and Josh was a big part of that recording process as well, was incredible. And I'm so grateful for it. But I definitely was like, with the new album, when the opportunity arose to work with Liv, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And I would never create a situation of all men anyway, again, because I feel like I know enough people now that I don't need to do that, and why would you do that? But but
yeah, isn't it like if you go to a show or something, or you watch a video of like this like super strong feminist woman, and she's like up on stage, and it's all like white guys behind her, it's like kind of like a little bit of a disappointment.
I find that really disappointing too, and I feel like it's changing quickly. Like I've seen already a number of my peers that have previously had all male and all white male bands start hiring women. I feel like I've been called for more side person jobs as a result, because people are kind of feeling like. But I do find that frustrating, especially if you have a festival lineup and they're like, look, we've got 3 females on the lineup. And I'm like, well, that's still, you know, they have 4 white dudes in their band. So you have actually now, you know, 50 musicians on stage and 3 of them are female. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah, literally 3.
So that's something. And I've actually gotten to produce 2 projects this year, and it feels so cool to be the one that calls the female drummer to come into the studio and calls the female, but you know, like I feel like having that, being that a gatekeeper in that way is like the coolest thing ever. So I try to be very mindful of that. But you know, we're all just trying our best. We're all just trying our best.
You seem like someone who's like constantly wanting to learn and grow, and I want to know more about like what that looks like in practice, especially when it comes to like getting outside of your comfort zone. So like especially like in this past year, white Americans have had a lot to reckon with, like when recognizing our privilege. So like in your experience, how have you responded to being uncomfortable when faced with that reckoning of like your own privilege, ignorance, misinformation, and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably similarly to most, white Americans that want to not be part of the problem. like it's always just trying to do something right and kind of messing up and having to be okay with that. The fact that like you're not always gonna, I think when you grow up in a privileged position, which I feel like I did, you're used to kind of doing things correctly and being told that you're doing them correctly. It's like, good job, you did that well, and I think when it comes to racial injustice, you just have to get really comfortable with the fact that like you're not always going to get a high five and you're not always going to do it right. Like that's just part of it. So
Yeah, I would also add that like you're not always going to do it right, and like some people are not going to be okay with that you've messed up.
I think that it can get a little extreme in terms of like being mad at people when they're clearly just like trying, and like I think it's totally fine to point out if you think it's like doing more harm than good, but I also think that there needs to be room for people to try and mess up and try as long as they're willing to redirect it. But yeah, like so for me, I write this monthly column for No Depression, and during July last summer when like the Black Lives Matter movement was kind of paramount in the public consciousness, I was like, well, I feel like I should kind of like pass this platform over, because the whole like idea right now is like we don't need to be like hearing from more white people about this. So I reached out to a bunch of folk musicians that were like people of color and asked anybody if they wanted to like contribute, and it was like this whole thing of like, well, some people want to say something. Some people feel like they're sick of being asked to say something. Some people feel like they don't want to do that work. Like it's a whole range, because like obviously like just because all these people are people of color doesn't mean that they have the same opinion or reaction or idea about the situation. And so I think it was such a charged time. Everyone was like so stressed out on so many levels and experiencing this like terrible moment in history, but also like a kind of a hopeful moment, that it was really uncomfortable. I mean, it was very uncomfortable because I was like definitely getting a lot of pushback. Like people were like, well, are we getting paid for this? And it was like I wasn't allowed to pay them because of like journalistic things about like paying sources. Like there was all these kind of like hoops. And so that was my experience with it. And I felt like, it definitely was, it was totally fine. I mean, it's like, that's just part of it. But I was uncomfortable. And I think that's just what you have to do. Like you have to get uncomfortable.
You said, I feel like being an effective activist is very different in 2021 than in 2017. It's where you're saying it's not about making the point. It's about making the point in a way that's humanizing. So can you talk a little bit more about how you came to this conclusion and how have you practiced this approach in real life? And it also kind of reminds me of how Amy Ray approaches like adversity against her and her family in her small town in North Georgia, of just being like, you can't just like write people off and yell at people all the time. I don't know if you're familiar with like how she deals with being gay. And
I'm familiar with Amy Ray, but I haven't heard the specifics about her like small town life, and that's really interesting. I think, I think this has been like over the past few years kind of a learning curve for me, and I do think that there was a lot of important things that needed to be said in 2016, 2017, and a lot of things that needed to get out there so that we could have these conversations, these difficult conversations. And everything escalated so much, and there's been like so much yelling and screaming. And at a certain point, I feel like the opinions are now out there, and like people know what the kind of various takes on an issue are. Not to say that like you shouldn't continue to discuss important issues. But for me, the opinions that I have, I don't feel like are anything that people haven't heard before. If I had, groundbreaking opinions, then maybe I would feel more inclined to like yell about them. But when I released Shame, like I do think that was something that people weren't really talking about, especially in the folk music scene. But now people are talking about everything. Like we've had a lot of really important conversations, which is great, and I am here for it. But as we've experienced like such a polarization and such an animosity, that we've literally, I in my short life have not experienced before in this country, the intensity of the divide. You kind of have to wonder like what is helpful and what is harmful at a certain point. And to me, like political conversations on the internet are largely harmful and not really helpful. So I've kind of shifted my idea about like what is a helpful form of communication. And songs and art to me are always going to be like the best way to get something across without shutting someone down. If it's done well.
It's hard.
It is hard, but it's like that's the work. That's the exciting thing. That's why you're an artist, That's the cool part.
I want to talk about how great Liv is. I want to give us some space.
Favorite subject.
Olivia Halley, the front woman of OPEP. I went to Miles of Music Camp the year that she and Peppy were there.
Awesome.
And I was like, there's not a more fun person on this planet.
Liv is just such a special person.
You actually went to Melbourne to record with Liv for the album Cycles. You wanted to like get into her scene. You said, like, I have this kind of theory that if you want a specific sound, you have to go to the place, use the studio, use the person, use the gear, get the vibe. What did you like about the vibe in Melbourne, and how was it, like, different than what you expected?
Well, it was largely what I expected. I mean, in some ways it was, like, the most quintessential Melbourne, where we were recording, like, a converted warehouse space with, like, really cool grungy artwork everywhere, and then the really awesome coffee shop down the road. It was like everything that you'd expect. I think the difference in mindset is pretty intense. Like I think here in Nashville, for example, if I'm working on a track and I'm having a specific idea about a sound or an instrument, there's like 20 people that I can call that are masters of that instrument or that sound, and they'll come in and play it, and you have everything at your fingertips. Basically all options are on the table. And working in Melbourne, it was like me, Liv, and Gormy in the studio, which he was the engineer, and if Liv or I had an idea, it was like we were going to go in and do it. So if she wanted to hear keys on something, she went in and played the piano, and like if I wanted weird sounds, like I had to go in there and make those sounds with my fiddle. And Sai came with me, who has been playing guitar with me for a long time. And so we did have him for a couple days, playing guitars, but everything else was largely just like more experimental and more risky and more of just us coming up with it. And I love that because I think that made it a little more stripped down, a little more sparse, a little more direct, and a little more intense, which I like. Like I'm an intense person. I like intense music and grungy, because we're just doing it ourselves, and that's the sound that we're going to get. So
I want to ask about a few songs on Cycles, including the title track, which I don't know if I can describe without my eyes starting to sweat profusely.
That's so nice.
It's a pretty tough song. Your sister-in-law had a miscarriage at 5 months pregnant, and you wrote the song with Liv to honor the strength that is passed down from woman to woman in the face of childbirth. Even not knowing what it's about, it's like such a great listen. And then I read your track notes on it and was like, what the fuck? How do you even approach a song like that? So I guess like I just like don't have any like particular question, but like how did you write that song?
Well, that song was the catalyst for working with Liv, because we wrote that song before I had asked her if she wanted to do the whole album with me. And I think it was part of the reason why I was so excited about putting together a female team, because I had that story, in me, and I was thinking about it a lot, and I wanted to write about it that day for whatever reason. Like that's what was on my mind. And when I sat down with Liv and we were talking about it, like it just was so easy to talk about that subject. And she also has a sister that she's really close with, and like I just felt like there was such a fundamental understanding of what I was like wrestling with, and that kind of it's all part of the conversation we had previously about like assembling a team that has different perspectives, and like not just having all men and like one female front person, if that's you, if you're the front person. But that song, happened really not easily time-wise, but easily inspiration-wise. Like it was easy to write with her. We spent hours on it, but it was like good flowing hours. Mm-hmm. And we were both really in love with it as we were writing it. And I like frantically asked if she could get in the studio with me to make a demo with it like the next day. And it was the night before she was leaving for back to Melbourne. And yeah, so we have a really cool demo of that song that's just us, and she's playing the drums, and she got food poisoning and like threw up in a bucket and then did some more vocal take. It was very like
that's something that could only happen to Liv.
I know, she's the coolest.
The song No Good Time for Dying, another incredible song about your grandmother and who has died.
Yeah.
It's about her death. And this song hit me particularly because my partner is a geriatric physician, so she's working in this world all the time. Wow. And I also have a very good friend who is working on a podcast called A Lovely Death that interviews like end of life care folks. Can you talk about your grandmother's life and death, and maybe how her death may have changed your relationship to end of life?
Yeah. My grandmother was a very zany character. I was lucky that she was around a lot because she lived, it's like 3 blocks from where I grew up. And she, didn't have an easy go of it. Like she had a very wild life, and she was not an easy person. She was a very difficult person, and she had a lot of sadness in her life, and she was one of those people that just kind of was always pushing on to the next thing, and maybe in an effort to not pay attention to what was happening in the present or what was like in the past. I think she was definitely always ready for the next adventure. She traveled a lot, and she had all kinds of like international boyfriends and affairs and dramas. When she was probably 72 or something, she asked me to make her an eHarmony profile, and she ended up meeting this guy in Guatemala and like going on some kind of romantic journey. Like she was just not your typical grandma, one could say. And she was she could be really rude, really mean, like really intrusive. Like she had a lot of problems. But for my dad, obviously he loves her, but like he had a very difficult childhood. And for me though, it was just like all fun and games because I had this like stable family, and she was just like the wild card that I got to enjoy. So that was kind of a special relationship. And I think that we have a lot in common, like I got a lot of her, probably got some of her mental illness, and also like her adventurous spirit, and just like there's a lot I think that we shared. And so I think that was part of why it was really hard to watch her kind of like lose her independence, because that was really what she held on to. She didn't have like a beautiful, perfect, stable life to look back on. Like if she couldn't look forward, she just got sad, and that was hard to watch. And I don't think that was a life that she ever wanted. I mean, I think her goal was always just to like never be in care or have that intense illness. And it was large. I mean, it really was a short time in the scheme of things, but it was a very sad thing to watch. And it kind of, for me, it was definitely like a wake-up call of how much we avoid thinking about this, and how much as a society we just kind of hide this phase of life away and try to pretend it doesn't exist, and try to pretend that everyone kind of dies in their sleep in a happy way, and it's just not true at all, which is lame. I wish it was true. It's not something I had thought about a lot prior to that experience, but it kind of forced me to pay attention a little more.
It's a wild song. On your record release day, I was walking around the neighborhood and that song came on, and I just I lost my jaw fell on the floor, and since I was outside, it was hard to find it. But I immediately sent it to a bunch of people. I've never heard a song like that before. It's really, really lovely.
I'm really glad that it meant something to you, and a number of people have reached out about that song. So it's I know it's a difficult one, but I'm glad that it can at least make people feel not alone in their experience. Or
I have to empty out my eyes.
Okay.
Sorry. Rachel, just stop writing these goddamn songs that. Whew. Okay. One more thing, and then we can stop crying. This is called the lightning round.
Oh, okay. Fun.
Ready. Set.
Okay.
You ready? Okay.
I wasn't afraid I'm going to say something embarrassing. Okay.
Oh, well, that's the hope.
Oh, no. Okay, go for it.
What is the first song you learned on the guitar?
There's Your Trouble by the Dixie Chicks.
Ooh, good one.
Maybe? That could be a lot.
What is your karaoke song?
Reba Fancy.
Wow. Okay. These are home runs. Dogs or cats or something else?
Definitely dogs.
What is your coffee order?
Cappuccino.
First celebrity crush?
Shane West.
Who is that?
Do you remember that really schmaltzy movie, A Walk to Remember?
Oh, he's the boy. I didn't know there was a boy in that movie. I only saw Mandy Moore. Sorry.
That is an amazing reply. There's a boy.
Who is the nicest musician you've ever met?
Brittany Haas.
First album you bought with your own money?
Okay, very embarrassing. Faith Hill, Breathe.
Ooh, that's
this is so weird and not indicative, but that's fine.
First concert?
Nickel Creek.
Well, there we go, redemption.
Very on brand.
Yes. Last book you read?
I just read, this is very embarrassing, but this book is called Red, White, and Royal Blue, and it is a gay romance between the first son of the U.S. and the Prince of England, and it's the most amazing version of the world that you could imagine. Highly recommend.
That sounds like a bedtime story that I would ask my brother to tell me.
It's kind of like
when I was a little
it's
kid.
It's like a revisionist history of the 2016 election, because it's there's a female president and her son. It's ridiculous, but honestly, I'm emotional about it because it made me feel so many things.
What is it called again?
It's called Red, White, and Royal Blue. It's that is embarrassing. I wish I could say it was high shelf literature, but I also feel this book deserves to not be written off because it's very good.
Okay, a couple more. Flying or invisibility?
Invisibility, because I kind of hate flying.
Because what?
I don't really enjoy flying. In a plane, so I don't imagine I would. Maybe that would be that might be the
We
wrong
will
answer.
accept that answer. Star Trek or Star Wars?
Oh my God, Star Trek. I've been forced to watch so much Star, so I kind of hate all of it. But Star Trek, I prefer to Star Wars.
Okay, here's the last one. Where is the most beautiful place you've ever visited?
The place that I wrote the song Wyoming Wildflowers is outside of Pinedale, Wyoming. It's probably the most beautiful place I've ever been.
Nice. Okay, that's it. Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a very surprising and amazing conversation. Thank you for having me.
It's a real whopper, huh?
It was a whopper, yes.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for spending so much time, and congratulations on the new record. I hope it wins every award.
Oh, thank you. Well, it was my pleasure, and thanks for listening and caring and investigating so deeply.
Basic Folk this week was produced by John Nungesser. Alex Stanton of Townspeople composes our music. Basic Folk is on the American Songwriter Podcast Network. I am your host, Cindy Howes. Thank you so much for checking out the episode. If you liked what you hear, please tell a friend. You can tell them to go wherever they get podcasts, or you can find it at my website, basicfolk.com, and we'll talk to you later. Okay, bye.